The Source: The Twisted Tale of How an L.A. Kingpin Paid the Jalisco Price, by Matthew B. Cox. Narrated by Brian Wiggins. Some of the names in this piece have been changed to protect identities. The slender Hispanic male, veiled in a hooded sweatshirt and dark pants with short black cropped hair, stealthily approached the large beige house, a pistol tucked in the small of his back. It was December 12, 2011, in the city of Arcadia, a wealthy suburban Los Angeles bedroom community, nestled against the San Gabriel foothills. The man slipped around the corner of the three-car garage to the single side door. There, he pressed his weight into the door and frame, forcing it to give. The assassin stepped into the garage and was enveloped by the darkness, where he waited for his prey. Not unlike the character Carlos Ayala, the dashingly handsome top cocaine distributor for the fictitious Obregon Cartel in the movie Traffic, Jose Antonio Parra lived in a large affluent home resting on its own private cul-de-sac called Christie Court, surrounded by lush manicured shrubs and a freshly cut lawn. Just another well-kept Spanish stucco multi-story home, revealing nothing of its owner. The neighbors knew only that the couple's 3 young children played in the fenced backyard under their mother's watchful eye. By all appearances, their father was a successful businessman. Nothing indicated that Parra worked for the Sinaloa Cartel. At its peak between 2003 and 2008, the Sinaloa Cartel, taking its name from the Mexican Pacific state of Sinaloa, where the cartel was formed, was the largest and most powerful drug trafficking organization to have ever existed. The cartel's leaders controlled a multi-billion-dollar network responsible for importing hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. Throughout that period, Jose Parra operated a Los Angeles-based wholesale distribution cell for the cartel and was a key operative in its American-based distribution network. The assassin waited in the shadows while the Parra family attended Catholic Mass at a nearby church. Just after 8 p.m., Parra pulled his expensive sedan into the garage. Once the family exited the vehicle, the man emerged, pointing his weapon. His hood pulled taut around his head, exposing little more than his brown eyes and a Band-Aid on his upper left cheek. Everyone was herded into the house, where the intruder locked Parra's wife and children in a first-floor bedroom. Parra's wife would later tell the homicide detectives she heard her husband and the intruder speaking briefly in the hallway, arguing about a debt owed to the cartel. A $2 million loss Parra insisted he wasn't responsible for. Then the assassin fired 4 shots into Parra's head from close range. He went to his death, denying responsibility. Seconds later, Parra's wife and 3 young children found him lying motionless in a crimson pool on the cool marble floor. A professional, cold-blooded murder that, to this day, has not been solved. My name is Matthew Cox, and I write true crime from the inside of the Federal Correctional Complex in Coleman, Florida, the largest prison complex in the United States. I've been incarcerated since November 16, 2006, for a variety of bank fraud-related charges, and I am 100% guilty of them all. Some inmates do their time working out in the institution's recreation yard. Others learn to play an instrument. It probably sounds silly. I write my fellow inmates' stories. In the fall of 2016, I was introduced to Cristiano Silva, an inmate who had recently been transferred to the prison. Chris is tan, with a wiry build and a burr haircut, a bright guy who quickly became known for having a keen legal mind. I had some legal questions regarding a manuscript I'd authored with a fraudster named Ephraim Deveroli, a true crime memoir chronicling Deveroli's life as a teen stoner gun runner who'd made millions selling weapons to the U.S. military until the government turned on him. Upon his release from prison, Deveroli published the book under the title Once a Gun Runner. Then he turned around and sued Warner Brothers for theft of intellectual property. But he never paid me for it, I griped to Chris during one of our first discussions on the subject. The guy's using the book that I wrote to sue Warner Brothers. Diveroli had alleged that Warner Brothers had stolen the manuscript and used it to make the movie War Dogs. The same manuscript that he stole from me. The guy's a total scumbag. The lack of payment alone shows Diveroli's intent of never honoring your agreement, replies Chris. He mentions needing to do some research in the institution's legal library the following morning and offers to check into it. He's very professional, a rare characteristic among inmates. I don't know anything about Chris or his case, and I ask, "Were you an attorney on the street?" "Nah," he grunts. "Drug dealer. What about you?" "Con man." Nice. That's how I met Chris Silva. Our interactions are typically short, clipped, and direct. Above all, brutally honest. There's simply no reason to bullshit one another. The next day, the drug dealer turned jailhouse lawyer informs me that based on Diveroli's bad faith, he feels I have a strong case. Additional research solidifies my standing regarding Warner Brothers, and Chris starts ordering court documents. "You need to sue these guys," says Chris, after receiving Diveroli's amended complaint against the studio, Diveroli, and Warner Brothers. "I'm in prison. How am I going to sue him? I don't have any money to hire a lawyer." "I'll do it," he fires back. Chris has fought dozens of inmates' criminal cases over the course of his tenure. However, following a transfer from Lompoc Federal Correctional Institution, California to Coleman FCC in Florida, he has ceased doing legal work for other inmates. Civil law can't be that much different than criminal. Using a 30-year-old Swintech typewriter with no word processing function, Chris begins litigating against Diveroli and Warner Brothers. During the course of the suit, we began to spend more and more time together. At one point, I ask him why he stopped doing legal work for other inmates. "On the West Coast, the prisons are packed with drug cases," he says. "That's mostly what I focus on." The answer was nonspecific, almost evasive. Incomplete. Based on our many conversations, it felt wrong, so I kept probing him for details. Eventually, he informs me that most of his past clients were Mexican cartel guys, specifically members of the Sinaloa Cartel. By the turn of the century, Ismael El Mayo Zambada was the head of the Sinaloa Cartel. This was before the drug trafficking syndicate had achieved international notoriety. Back then, it was merely one of a handful of cartels operating out of western Mexico. The Sinaloa Cartel was embroiled in full-blown gang warfare, simultaneously fighting the Tijuana Cartel from the north and its more powerful ally, the Gulf Cartel, in the east. While each of the West Coast cartels operated independently, they all struggled with the same problem: the rise of the Gulf Cartel. Drastic action was necessary before they were all swept under the control of their rivals. Deep in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Sinaloa, Mayo formulated a plan. With the help of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who, along with Mayo, were the founders of the Sinaloa Cartel, they were able to persuade Ignacio El Nacho Coronel, the leader of the powerful organization controlling the Mexican state of Jalisco, to help them form a confederation among the Pacific Coast cartels, a super cartel. Mayo's plan was to create a drug trafficking behemoth strong enough to mount a united front against the Tijuana and Gulf cartels. In short order, Mayo, Chapo, and Nacho entered into a strategic alliance with the leaders of the other regional cartels throughout Mexico to create what became known formally as El Cartel del Pacífico, the Pacific Cartel, or, less formally, El Federación, the Federation. The Sinaloa Federation operated on a horizontal leadership structure. The cartel's operatives each controlled certain territories, making up a decentralized network of bosses who conducted business through cooperative arrangements. Together, under the leadership of Chapo Guzman, the Federation launched offensives against the Tijuana and Gulf cartels. Over the next few years, the Sinaloa Federation eliminated all competition along the border from San Diego, California to El Paso, Texas. 17 ports of entry were firmly under their control. Each of the Federation's major factions worked with one another to smuggle drugs into the United States, where American-based organizations then distributed the product throughout the country. One of the primary drug smuggling routes between the United States and Mexico stretches from Tijuana to Mexicali in Baja California, a 100-mile stretch of the American border with 6 ports of entry, 3 of which fall within the metropolitan San Diego area. Mayo Zambada's faction of the Federation controlled the San Diego-Tijuana corridor. A high-ranking member of Zambada's organization, Germán El Paisa Olivares, controlled the flow of cocaine through the lucrative Tijuana Plaza. Germán Olivares, known simply as G to his American associates, has been described by Justice Department officials as a shadowy underworld figure and a member of the Federation's upper echelon. As Mayo's top lieutenant, G coordinated the importation of multi-ton quantities of cocaine into the U.S. on behalf of the Zambada, Guzman, and Coronel factions of the cartel. It was Jose Parra in Los Angeles who took delivery of G's shipments. Parra operated a distribution cell for Mayo and G, distributing thousands of kilograms of cocaine worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was also responsible for coordinating the delivery of shipments to the Federation's other distributors in Los Angeles, including, among others, Juan Garcia. "There are cartel guys here," I informed Chris in January 2017. "We're walking the half-mile track in the prison's rec yard while discussing my civil case. They might be Sinaloa." "Yeah, but I'm not interested in picking up any law work right now." We walk in silence for a while, and he continues. "I worked a guy's case in Lompoc, an idiot named Juan Garcia, whose sister married Nacho Coronel's nephew. Although the bulk of the cartel's operations are decentralized, their internal hierarchy is very much a family business. Fathers, brothers, sons, nephews, cousins, and in-laws occupy the top positions in most of the organizations. As insurance, everyone holding a key position knows their associate's family. The potential for murderous reprisals is ever present. Because of this lying Lilliputian, grumbles Chris, the whole case went sideways." The air brakes hissed as J&M Express's tractor-trailer, bound for New York, rolled out of the Inland Empire truck stop, one of dozens of massive asphalt parking lots scattered throughout Southern California, packed with big rigs, all virtually indistinguishable from one another. Juan and his driver, Jesus Dominguez, had just loaded 180 kilos of the Federation's cocaine into a clavo, or secret compartment, within the rig's bowels. A smug smile crept across Juan's face as the trailer's taillights grew faint. The first-generation Mexican-American's diminutive frame only accentuated his overinflated ego. It was more than a simple Napoleon complex. Juan was arrogant. Perhaps, in that moment, he had a right to be. Juan had multiple drivers traversing the lower 48's interstate system, containing all manner of goods. However, his bread and butter was trafficking the Federation's cocaine. Only days earlier, 180 kilos had been delivered to Chicago, and an additional 180 more were en route to New York. It was the fall of 2003, and Juan Garcia was at the top of the trafficking game. Due to the cartel's interconnected web of family relations, he'd been given a position within the organization ran by Nacho Coronel's nephew, Ricardo Madrigal Barajas, Juan's cunado, brother-in-law, and best friend. Using tractor-trailers equipped with hidden compartments, Barajas and Juan were responsible for distributing the Federation's cocaine to the Bernales organization in Chicago and the Moreno organization in New York, both of which were headed up by Barajas' cousins, Cuco Bernales and Johan Moreno. Between the spring of 2001 and the spring of 2002, the cunados transported in excess of 2 tons of product without so much as a hiccup. Then, on March 25, 2002, Barajas was arrested in Indiana for drug trafficking. Luckily, Juan managed to avoid being indicted. Regardless, the trafficking operation had come to a screeching halt. By this point, Mayo, Chapo, and Nacho had formed the Sinaloa Federation. The factions these men controlled coordinated their smuggling activities through the Federation's cooperative arrangements and relied on one another's American-based networks to distribute the cocaine and facilitate its transportation to regional hubs for delivery to wholesale customers. Basically, their networks were interconnected. Cocaine supplied by Chapo's faction might be smuggled through tunnels controlled by Mayo's people and transported throughout the United States by Nacho's organization. Shortly after Barajas' arrest, Juan was contacted by Parra's right-hand man, Jose Salinas. The Federation needed him to fill the void left by the arrest of his cunado. Within months, Juan had purchased 2 slightly used Freightliner tractor trailers, which he then had modified with a hidden compartment designed to remain undetectable by the Department of Transportation inspectors, and opened J&M Express with a truck driver, Jesus Dominguez. He put together a network of drivers willing to transport tons of cocaine to Chicago and New York. Juan and Cuco Bernales formed a partnership, took over responsibility for Barajas' operation, and began shipping cocaine throughout the United States. Like clockwork, every month to 6 weeks, Parra and Salinas dropped off 300 kilos for transportation. The product was stored at Juan's stash house, an upper-middle-class residence in the conservative suburb of Rancho Cucamonga. The taillight disappeared into the distance. Dominguez would arrive in New York within 5 days. He would drop off the product and pick up $4 million owed from the previous month's shipment. Juan had it all figured out. During the course of the past 10 months, he had made millions for both the cartel and himself. This guy didn't earn his position, Chris informs me with a hint of disdain. Juan hadn't risen through the ranks, learning the drug trade through trial and error. He hadn't dodged indictments and watched his peers go to prison. He hadn't learned the lessons that only came with experience. Unlike Chris, who started his drug career at 19 with a single ecstasy pill, Juan's sister married him into the business. The guy drove a canary yellow Hummer with over a dozen flat screens in it and blew tens of thousands of dollars in strip clubs, which is fine in Vegas, but you don't do that in your own backyard. He did all the things a professional doesn't do, I interject for clarity. Precisely, agrees Chris. He thought he was Chapo Guzman. In the autumn of 2003, the police received a 911 call regarding a domestic dispute at a shabby apartment complex in Bellflower, a routine call for the area. Parra and 2 of his associates were seated at the dining room table in Parra's stash house located within the complex. Methodically, the 3 men counted out drug proceeds, segregating G's money into $10,000 stacks held in place by a thick rubber band. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were heaped into a duffel bag lying on the carpet. When the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department deputies arrived at the complex, they mistakenly went to the wrong apartment. Parra and his henchmen were unprepared when the officers banged on the front door. Seconds later, they forced their way into the apartment, in search of the domestic dispute victim, catching Parra and his accomplices in the act. The 3 men were arrested. Parra's associates were subsequently released on bond. Parra, however, was on state parole in addition to being an illegal alien. Therefore, Parra was held in custody for violating parole. He remained in custody until the following spring. Weeks later, on December 9th, while transporting 46 kilograms of Parra's cocaine to New York, Juan's driver, Dominguez, was pulled over by the Illinois State Police. The officer asked Dominguez to consent to a search. It wasn't the first time Dominguez's rig had been randomly chosen for inspection. None had ever come close to finding the clavo. As a result, he confidently volunteered a search of the rig. This time, however, the officer noticed a slight inconsistency in the living quarters cabin space, betraying a concealed compartment containing nearly $1 million worth of cocaine. Dominguez was promptly arrested for drug trafficking. Shortly after the DEA arrived at the police department, Dominguez agreed to cooperate. He admitted to transporting in excess of 1,000 kilos from Los Angeles to New York, in addition to shuttling over $12 million in drug proceeds over the preceding 11 months. Within hours, Dominguez made several calls to Juan that were monitored by the agents. Those calls, coupled with his statement, gave the government probable cause to obtain a wiretap on Juan's cell phone 9 days later. From that point forward, December 18th, everyone that Juan spoke with became a target of the DEA's investigation. Their phones were then subjected to wiretaps, and the individuals they called then became targets as well. Out of this overlapping, interconnected spiderweb of wiretaps emerged dozens of potential targets consisting of thousands of hours of highly incriminating recordings. Following Dominguez's last call, he vanished off Juan's radar. However, during the lag time between the monitored calls and the wiretaps, Juan arranged, through Juan Ordenes' company, DB Do Trucking, to have a second driver, Cleofas Vasquez, transport 180 kilos to Cuco in Chicago. Cuco then had the shipment rerouted to his cousin, Johan Moreno, in New York. There, he picked up $4 million and delivered it to Juan in L.A. On February 4, 2004, Vasquez picked up a vehicle transport loaded with automobiles, one of which was a Mitsubishi Montero containing a clavo with nearly $1 million concealed inside. Based on the information obtained from the wiretap on Juan's phone, the DEA arranged to have the New Jersey State Police pull over the tractor-trailer, at which time the DEA identified the Mitsubishi out of several vehicles, which the state police promptly seized. The detectives then discussed the situation with Vasquez, who vehemently denied having any knowledge of the Mitsubishi's contents, stating, "I'm just a driver, man." At that point, a detective handed him a business card, said, "Tell the Montero's owner to call me," and then released him. Once he was back on the road, Vasquez called Juan. In a panic, he conveyed the news about the seizure. The following morning, at 7:32 a.m., Juan called Salinas and said, "They're after us, dude." Salinas grunted, half asleep. "They are after us," repeated Juan. "They got that guy, the one with the money." "No way." "I'll call you back, dude," said Juan. "I'm all fucked up right now." At this point, between the Dominguez and Vasquez seizures, Juan had lost over $2 million of the cartel's cash and cocaine, and all he had to show for it was a business card. He was frantic. Desperation was setting in. "The thing about the cartel is they don't like losses, but they'll deal with them," says Chris as we sit at a table made of concrete and rebar, sweating in the merciless Florida humidity, provided the losses aren't suspect. That was the problem. Juan had no explanation as to how the DEA knew about the Mitsubishi or why the driver hadn't been arrested. Nor could he account for why there wasn't at least $2 million in the truck. So the cartel was going to kill him? Well, Chris rocked his head from side to side in contemplation. Yes and no. If you can convince them that your actions were reasonable, typically they'll let you work off the loss. The source of the cartel's cocaine originates in the fields in the Andes Mountains and the jungle labs of Colombia. The product is then transported to Venezuela. There, it's distributed in multi-ton loads to various Mexican drug cartels. Back in the mid-2000s, a kilogram of cocaine would cost $2,000 in Venezuela, with a minimum purchase of 1,800 kilos. Each time the product is moved, it incurs additional costs. In Acapulco, that same kilo costs roughly $4,000. The closer the cocaine gets to the border, the more it costs. Once the product reaches Mexico City, the amount increases to around $7,000. By the time it gets to the Tijuana border, the value of that kilo is somewhere in the neighborhood of $9,000. But you've got to get it across the border. That's where G comes in, admits Chris. G controls multiple tunnels for the Sinaloa Cartel, which are used to transport drugs into Southern California, a service they provide to all of the organizations operating in Sinaloa-controlled territory for a modest $2,500 per kilo fee, known as piso. For Parra, LA prices ran around $14,000 per kilo. Juan and Cuco were paying Parra $18,500 per on a consignment basis. Now, if you lose the product, you're on the hook for that material, but there's always the chance they'll let you pay it back at the Tijuana price. In a lull between Chris's statement, I jot down, Tijuana price, and he punctuates his statement with, assuming they don't kill you. The small restaurante was closed. However, there were well over 24 serious men, holding fully automatic weapons, standing guards scattered about the entrance, perimeter, and inside. It was spring 2004. The area surrounding the restaurant in Guadalajara, Jalisco's state capital, was desolate. The local policia had been told not to enter that section of the city. Cartel business. Days earlier, Salinas had called Juan with the news he didn't want to hear. G wants to see you in Guadalajara. Parra had been deported to Mexico, and he and G wanted an accounting. As Juan, Cuco, and Moreno stepped into the restaurant Nacho Coronel, the head of the Federation's Jalisco faction, G and Parra were seated at a table with several other men. None of them looked happy. Standing in front of Nacho, G, and Parra, the scene played out like an inquisition, with one relentlessly, harshly worded accusation after another, while half a dozen grim-faced bodyguards stood poised to put a bullet in their heads. G, who was there representing Mayo, one of the founders of the Sinaloa Cartel, wanted to know precisely how the DEA knew to take the Mitsubishi. Why wasn't the driver arrested? He asked the trio. You got an answer for that? Maybe someone out of New York is cooperating. Well, then how do you explain the earlier Illinois seizure? Juan stammered out one pathetic excuse after another, each one more implausible than the next, as Cuco and Moreno stood silent. With each of Juan's excuses, he tossed another shovelful of dirt onto their graves. You took it upon yourself to sell my product, not your product, my product, which you lost, interjected Parra. That cost us $800,000. Juan then had another million seized by the DEA. He was currently short an additional $2 million. Not your cash, my cash, spat Parra as he flipped the detective's card over in his hand, suspiciously examining the thin cardboard rectangle. You owe us $3.8 million, and you hand me a business card. How'd this happen, Juan? At this point, Nacho interrupted, pointing out to G that Juan was his nephew's cunado, and Cuco was his nephew's primo, or cousin. These are good men. They've done a lot of work for us. They didn't steal the money. Everyone in the room knew their relationship to Nacho was the only reason they were still alive, but there was no guarantee they were going to stay that way. Maybe, before Juan could come up with an excuse that would potentially get them all executed and buried in the desert, Cuco stepped forward and replied, Look, we can't account for what happened, but we're here, and we're going to get you the 3.8. We just need some time. Juan, Cuco, and Moreno walked away from that meeting with their lives. Shortly thereafter, as a show of good faith, Cuco returned to Guadalajara and transferred the title to his ranch in Mexico to G. He and Juan then began frantically scraping together the funds owed. In a moment of desperation, Juan called Parra and pleaded with him to give them a break on the price. They wanted Tijuana prices of $8,500 per kilo on at least the 91 kilos that had been seized in New York and Illinois. But Parra refused. Let's see what G has to say, said Juan, asking to discuss the matter with G directly. If G wants to, then it's a go, all right? Well, no, replied Parra. It can't be done. Regardless of Parra's objection, Juan called G. However, the call did not go well, and Juan was specifically told they could not pay Tijuana prices. Miraculously, within a month, Juan and Cuco managed to come up with the remainder of what they owed Parra, G, and Mayo. Once they'd piled the bundles of bills into Juan's Hummer, the partners stared into the rear of the vehicle. The cash represented everything they had, and they were about to hand it over to Parra. Cuco turned to Juan and said, One day, we're going to kill this motherfucker. He actually said that? I ask. Yeah, admits Chris. Juan said Cuco was adamant Parra had to go. He was just biding his time. Once they cleared the debt, Parra suggested that Juan set up a new trucking company. He bought another tractor-trailer and had it outfitted with a clavo. He was back in business. Then, just prior to the arrival of an 800-kilo shipment, 300 of which were allocated to Juan and Cuco, the DEA executed arrest warrants. They snatched up Salinas on July 8, 2004, and 2 days later, they grabbed Juan, followed by Ordenas, Vasquez, and Juan's cousin, Ernesto Garcia. Under the fluorescent lights in a conference room at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles, David Arredondo slid a DEA report across the table to Juan during their second attorney-client meeting. Arredondo, a prominent Los Angeles drug attorney who served as counsel for Nacho Coronel's organization, tapped his pointer finger at the phrase Jose, LNU, last name unknown, CI on the report. "Your buddy Jose's the informant," he said, indicating Parra was a CI or confidential informant. As it turned out, that report was nothing more than a summary of Salinas' statements to the DEA, wherein Salinas indicated his belief that Parra was a CI. "I've had my suspicions about him since that Baltimore case." "No, that can't be right. He's G's guy," replied Juan. Despite the lawyer's certainty, Juan refused to accept it. "Jose's too high up." Within days of that meeting, Juan spoke to another inmate named Mamucas, who told him he'd been busted directly after purchasing 50 kilos of cocaine from Parras and Salinas. "I didn't get but a couple miles and they pinched me," he said. "I think Jose Parra set me up." In addition to Mamucas' arrest, Parra's brother-in-law had earlier been indicted in Baltimore for conspiracy to distribute over 100 kilos. Plus, there was Fortunato Franco, another of Parra's distributors. He'd gotten in excess of 100 kilos seized in L.A., as did Jesus Montano and Abel Zendejas. They were busted with 26 kilos purchased from Francisco Chico Perez, another one of Parra's distributors, while Basquel, one of Salinas' customers, got picked up for 15 kilos. Despite all of these seizures and arrests, Parra had never been charged. This, coupled with Arredondo's statements that Parra was a CI, convinced Juan that Parra was responsible for his predicament. Suddenly it all made sense. Parra had been secretly working with the DEA. As a result, Juan's attorney, David Arredondo, filed a motion to suppress the wiretap evidence based on the fact that the government had an informant, Jose Parra, operating within the organization and therefore lacked the necessity to obtain the wiretaps. During arguments, Assistant U.S. Attorney Mark Berger stated that Arredondo's claim was baseless conjecture and unfounded speculation. The prosecutor insisted that the government had no knowledge of any Jose Parra. AUSA Berger argued that if Mr. Arredondo wants a hearing, he has to provide some sort of factual basis to believe that there was an informant named Jose Parra. Arredondo's motion basically is wild speculation. It's ridiculous. Shortly thereafter, the motion was denied, and with it, all hope of going to trial. The government had hundreds of calls incriminating Juan and Salinas, and there was nothing they could do. On March 29, 2005, Juan appeared before Judge Baer and pled guilty to count 1 of the superseding indictment. A few days earlier, Salinas had done the same. Prior to their sentencing, however, Ordenas, Vasquez, and Ernesto Garcia proceeded to trial. On April 20, 2005, DEA agent Kuehler testified regarding 2 of the wiretapped calls. The agent testified that on May 13, 2004, 3 months after the Vasquez seizure, the DEA had intercepted a call between Juan and someone named Jose that indicated that Juan owed Jose and someone named G a considerable amount of money stemming from multiple seizures of cocaine and drug proceeds. Ordenas, Vasquez, and Ernesto Garcia were all found guilty. Then, at Juan and Salinas' sentencing on July 13, 2005, Arredondo, in an attempt to mitigate Juan's role in the conspiracy, told the judge, "It's interesting that the guy, Jose Parra, the central figure of this whole thing, was never arrested, never apprehended." He explained that Parra was the supplier of the cocaine and the prime mover of this case. For some reason, he is still out there, even though in California he was arrested and released. "Well," replied the judge, directing the question to AUSA Berger, "what does the government have to say about all that?" "I'll start with this name, Jose Parra, which seems to keep surfacing but really only from Mr. Arredondo's mouth. This name was never mentioned at trial, as best as I can remember. No case agents have ever heard of this individual. The prosecutor continued with, "It seems that what Juan and Arredondo are trying to do is create this imaginary individual who is the big kingpin, whereas, in reality, the two kingpins are sitting right behind me." Based on the government's denial of Parra's existence, the court determined that Juan and Salinas were the most culpable participants in the conspiracy. "If there was a leader," said the judge to Juan, "you and your co-defendant are it." He then sentenced Juan to 292 months. Salinas subsequently received 264 months. "What about Parra and Cuco?" I asked Chris. At the time of Juan's arrest, both Cuco and Parra had been in Mexico. Shortly thereafter, both of them returned to California. "Cuco took over responsibility for Barajas' trafficking operation in Los Angeles," replies Chris. "Before Juan ever even appeared before the judge in New York, the operation was firing on all cylinders." Both Nacho and G were impressed by how Cuco had handled himself and the debt owed by him and Juan. That resulted in fast-tracking Cuco's position within Nacho's organization. In fairly short order, he was moving a considerable amount of product and interacting with not only Parra, but G as well. Cuco's star was on the rise. "When you were out there, in Los Angeles, did you know G?" I ask. At this point, I know some of the particulars regarding Chris's case. They're not pretty. "Were you at that level?" "Yeah," he sighs. "I knew him. He wasn't Mayo's top lieutenant back then, but still pretty important." Cristiano Silva was a drug trafficker long before he was a jailhouse lawyer. He began distributing MDMA, or ecstasy, in the Beverly Hills area back in the late 1980s. Within a few years, his drug activity escalated to cocaine and crystal methamphetamine, or ice. The bulk of the cocaine and, later, methamphetamine used to produce the ice was supplied by the Sinaloa Cartel. Although Chris's contact was subordinate to G, he had participated in various meetings with high-ranking representatives from the cartel who had tried to persuade Chris to shift the ice manufacturing operation to Mexico. As the operation grew, the quantities, the money, and the stakes got higher. According to law enforcement, Chris's drug activity helped create the ice epidemic and led to the murder of an FBI informant. Chris's drug activity sparked investigations by the FBI, the DEA, the California Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, and the Los Angeles Police Department. Ultimately, he was indicted in the latter part of the 90s for conspiracy to distribute cocaine and crystal methamphetamine, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, and murder in the furtherance of a drug conspiracy, among other charges. In 2000, Chris, then 30 years old, was convicted and sentenced to over 30 years in prison. Over the next decade, he bounced between institutions within the federal prison system. "When I first fell," says Chris, "it quickly became clear I didn't have any natural allies." He wasn't affiliated with any gang or cartel, nor was he physically big enough to stand alone against the various factions competing for power within the maximum security prison where he was being housed. As a result, it became important to make himself indispensable to the inmate population. He needed to be someone that everyone would need at some point. There aren't a lot of articulate inmates, so guys started coming to me. They'd ask me to help them write a letter to their lawyer or their judge. That turned into quashing warrants for drug traffickers, many of whom were Mexican nationals. The mindset of a Mexican national prisoner is vastly different than that of an American inmate. An American prisoner wants to get his sentence cut to time served. The Mexican national inmate, however, only wants to get his sentence reduced low enough to be eligible for a treaty transfer back to Mexico. Unfortunately, none of that's possible as long as there are outstanding U.S. warrants. "What type of warrants?" I ask. "It could be anything. DUI, failure to appear in court, anything." He then moved on to challenging inmates' sentences. By then, he had begun developing the skills necessary to litigate habeas actions, also known as a Section 2255 motion, and various other motions seeking sentence reductions. Once a Mexican national has less than 8 years remaining on his sentence, he's eligible for a treaty transfer, says Chris. If he's got money, which most of these cartel guys have, it's not unheard of to have a corrupt Mexican prosecutor file bogus charges against one of their citizens in federal prison to get him extradited to Mexico to face those charges. Of course, once he's on their soil, they drop the charges and the guy walks, after he gets resentenced in accordance with Mexican law. So, over the period of, a decade, I say, you educated yourself on criminal law and post-conviction litigation. A little less than that, but yeah. By the time Chris was transferred to the low-security prison at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lompoc, California, in 2010, he was primarily focusing on the more wealthy prisoners' cases, which, for the most part, meant interacting with cartel members. He had become a conduit between the inmates and their high-end defense attorneys. Over the years, Chris had developed claims that some of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys on the West Coast had litigated. The way it works is this, Chris tells me. Aside from the difficulty involved with communicating with an inmate, many of whom barely speak English or have a formal education, if an inmate pays an attorney $100,000 to file a Section 2255 motion, the more time the lawyer spends learning the facts of the case, the less profit they make. For example, if there's 200 hours of DEA wiretap recordings that need to be reviewed, at $600 an hour, that's 200 billable hours. Not to mention court appearances, researching case law, reading transcripts, drafting motions, etc. It doesn't take long before the attorney is working for free. Any lawyer that tells you that's not a factor is lying. To overcome this obstacle, Chris became a conduit between the inmates and their attorneys. He began spending time with the inmate clients, reviewing their cases and identifying claims and marshaling together the facts which could be used by their outside counsel. I became someone that the inmates respected and trusted more than their attorneys, and the lawyers valued my input because I could spend the time necessary with the prisoner to fully learn the facts of the case in a way no attorney could never do. Juan heard about the new hotshot jailhouse lawyer shortly after Chris stepped off the bus in May 2010. Over the preceding year, Chris's legal prowess had culminated in 4 inmates receiving sentence reductions and the immediate release of a 5th inmate. When Juan approached Chris outside his housing unit that summer, Chris was in the process of working on Eloy Sanchez Guerrero's case, a Sinaloa Cartel trafficker convicted of being the head of a massive multi-ton cocaine conspiracy who'd been sentenced to 360 months. Chris was working with David Chesnov's office, Guerrero's prominent criminal defense attorney out of Las Vegas, to prepare Guerrero's reply to the government's response to his habeas action. Chris arranged to meet with Juan the following week. At that time, while walking the track and circling the low-security's rec yard, Juan laid out his conspiracy theory regarding Jose Parra acting as a confidential informant for the DEA and how the government had covered that up by denying Parra existed. "Is that something I can use?" asked Juan. They lied. Parra's real. There were a couple of errors committed by Juan's attorney at sentencing, both of which could have been used to file a habeas action alleging ineffective assistance of counsel. However, Chris told Juan, at this point, you're time-barred. As an inmate convicted of a federal crime, Juan had to file his 2255 motion within 1 year of the date his sentence became final, which, in Juan's case, had been 5 years earlier. Barring certain circumstances, which didn't apply to Juan, any claims that he were to bring would have been time-barred. Chris explained to Juan that Congress and the courts had placed a higher value on the finality of a conviction over justice. There's nothing you can do. Over the next 6 months, Juan bounced some ideas off Chris in connection with his case, but none of them amounted to a viable claim. Then, 8 months later, on January 18, 2012, Juan caught up with Chris in the housing unit's quad. He'd just found out that during his co-defendant's trial, one of the DEA agents had testified regarding Jose Parra and his involvement in the drug conspiracy. "Does that help?" asked Juan. "Can I bring a claim?" "Maybe," replied Chris with a shrug. In his opinion, federal prosecutors are very good at manipulating the facts of a case. They do so, however, through omission rather than resorting to telling bold-faced lies. Chris explained that if Juan could prove the government knew, or should have known, Parra existed, then you could attack the sentence based on newly discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, assuming your attorney wasn't aware of the factual predicates underlying your claim. If that's true, you might have a chance, but I'd need to see your co-defendant's transcripts. Knowing there was a chance Chris might end up referring Juan to Chesnov, he asked some of the paisas about Juan's ability to pay the high-end lawyer's fee. Everyone who spoke with told him Juan's word was good. "He won't have no problems paying," said one cartel member. "His partner's got the Guadalajara Plaza. He's Jalisco, new generation." Another member told Chris, "That's one stand-up motherfucker." By the time the transcripts arrived, on April 30th, 2012, Chris was deep into another prisoner's case, as well as assisting his own attorneys to prepare another one of his appeals. He gave the documents a quick read, and, sure enough, a DEA agent named Kuehler had testified about a wiretapped conversation between Juan and an individual named Jose. It appeared, based on the transcripts, that not only did Juan owe this Jose a large sum of money, the wiretaps also established that Jose was the source of the cocaine and that Juan was his subordinate. Although the transcripts didn't state Parra's last name, it confirmed that Juan didn't concoct an imaginary individual, nor was he the kingpin of the organization. Most importantly, it proved the government misled the court when Assistant U.S. Attorney Berger stated that none of the DEA's agents had ever heard of this individual. "You might just have something here," said Chris. Between Juan's defense lawyer, David Arredondo, and Manuel Lopez, an earlier post-conviction attorney, it took several months to track down the case file, and an additional couple of months to produce the materials Chris needed. During this time, Chris and Juan had numerous discussions concerning Juan's claim that Parra was a DEA informant. The issue at hand was twofold. One, whether Parra actually existed, and, two, whether he'd been a federal informant. Chris had no intention of squandering his credibility with Chesnov's office by presenting Juan's theory that Parra was an informant unless Juan could convince him Parra was the source. "It doesn't make sense that Parra's the source of the DEA's information," explained Chris during one of their many walks on the rec yard. "Primarily because the millions of dollars in cocaine and cash seized by law enforcement was Parra's. He could be the biggest snitch on the West Coast," he continued. "There's one person he would have never told on. He would have never told on himself." "My lawyer told me he was the source," shrieked Juan, his little arms gyrating wildly in agitation. "The notion that this guy was setting up his own loads is absurd," Chris barked back. "Parra certainly wouldn't have set up Juan and Cuco knowing they owed him several $1,000,000 that he owed G. You guys were his best customers. And if he was the DEA's source, why hadn't Parra disclosed the location of Juan's Rancho Cucamonga stash house? From a trafficking perspective, what you're saying makes no sense, and from a law enforcement perspective, it makes even less sense. The authorities would have pulled Dominguez over outside LA. They would never have allowed this guy to drive 2,000 miles with $1 million worth of cocaine before pulling him over in some Midwestern state. And there's no way a New York prosecutor would have blatantly lied to a New York judge to conceal the existence of some LA informant." In addition to those discrepancies in Juan's theory, Parra had been incarcerated when both the Dominguez and Vasquez loads were intercepted. In Chris's view, this made it virtually impossible for Parra to have been the DEA's source of information. Sometime between late November and early December 2012, Chris was watching CNBC in his housing unit when Juan approached. "What if Parra was dead?" he casually asked. "Could we use that to prove he was an informant?" Chris gave him a sideways glance, immediately feeling something wasn't right. "What do you mean, dead?" "If he were dead," replied Juan with a shrug. "Depends on how he died. Was he hit by a bus dead, or a bullet in the back of the head dead?" "From what I heard," whispered Juan, "bullet." Chris pointed to the exit with his chin, and they moved the conversation outside, away from the other inmates, and asked for specifics. Juan knew few. He then advised Juan that if he, or his people, had anything to do with Parra getting killed, Chris couldn't have anything to do with his case. "This is serious," he told Juan. "I'm here on a contract killing of an informant case. I know how seriously the authorities take these matters. If you or your people had anything to do with this guy getting killed, under no circumstances should you initiate any attack on your sentence." No, we didn't have nothing to do with it," he replied. According to Juan, Parra's murder was completely unrelated to his case. There were plenty of people that wanted Parra dead. The motherfucker had it coming, but we didn't do it. The fact that Parra may have been murdered was the first indication that he may have been a DEA informant. There would have to be media and law enforcement reports that could be used to disprove the government's claim that Parra was an imaginary individual. In January 2013, the case file materials arrived. With the exception of Attorney Arredondo's statements to the judge, there was not a single document indicating Parra existed, much less was the DEA's source. "I spent 5 days reading every single piece of paper," Chris tells me, "and not once did Parra's name appear. The wiretap applications were clearly a result of Dominguez's cooperation, thus blowing up Juan's theory that his investigation had emerged from an earlier Parra-related investigation originating in Baltimore. In fact, everything indicated it was Juan that had unwittingly gotten everyone busted by continuing to use his cell phone after Dominguez and the load of cocaine disappeared. This was where Juan's lack of experience led to everyone's detriment. What did Juan say? His ego wouldn't allow him to accept it. Juan refused to believe that he'd been responsible for the losses or for destroying half a dozen people's lives, including his own. "After I read the wiretap applications, I knew that all of these men were in prison because of Juan's incompetence." Regardless, it was becoming more and more apparent that Juan's arrogance was hindering his ability to make rational decisions. "Every single person you spoke with on that phone, other than Parra and Cuco, is doing 15 to 20 years in prison," Chris told Juan after reviewing the documents. "You're all over the wiretaps. You're the source of the DEA's information." "That's not true," he growled. "It wasn't me, it was Parra. They're protecting him." "The only reason why Parra wasn't indicted along with you was because he had the good fortune of being in jail while you were blowing up everyone else's phones." Based on the information contained in the file, Chris told Juan he didn't feel comfortable approaching Chesnov's office with his claims. He explained that there was no reason for Juan to spend $150,000 on Chesnov when there was very little chance he'd get over the time bar. Regardless, Juan wanted to attack his sentence based on Parra being the kingpin and the prosecutor misleading the court. In Chris's opinion, federal judges don't make a point of over-sentencing inmates. They typically weigh the evidence and make well-thought-out decisions based on all of the pertinent facts. Now, are mistakes made? Certainly. But Chris doesn't believe that most judges act maliciously. Despite the untimeliness of Juan's claim, there was a small chance that the judge would find a way to correct the sentence if he believed that the Parra-related facts had affected the outcome of Juan's sentencing. So, Chris agreed to prepare and file Juan's motion. "But I'm telling you, Juan, if you had anything to do with Parra getting killed, I can't be involved with your habeas action," he said. "I'm not letting you jeopardize my case by getting me dragged into this." Chris was in the middle of his own appeal, and he had a very strong issue before the Ninth Circuit. He was confident he'd win his appeal and that he would get resentenced. However, he also knew once the government realized that Parra had been murdered, that might spark an investigation in which both Juan and he would be interviewed. "You can't put me in a position where I'll have to lie for you. I won't do it." "I had nothing to do with it," Juan insisted. "He was a snitch. Lots of people wanted him dead." Over the next 6 weeks, Chris prepared Juan's motion. As additional evidence to support Juan's motion, Chris asked his mother to mail him 4 sets of the media articles regarding the murder reported in the Los Angeles Times, the Pasadena Star-News, and the LA Weekly. On April 14, 2013, he was walking across the compound when Lieutenant Johnson with the prison's Special Investigative Services Unit stopped Chris. "Silva," said the lieutenant, "what's with all this Jose Parra stuff?" Someone in the mailroom had caught the multiple sets of articles and forwarded them to the SIS unit. This doesn't have anything to do with your case, does it? I mean, you're here on a murder case. No, I'm doing some legal work for one of the paisas, Juan Garcia. Those are exhibits in support of his 2255 motion. Chris then summarized the case for Lieutenant Johnson and convinced him to release the articles to Juan. As Chris and Johnson parted ways, the lieutenant wheeled around and asked, "I've got a question for you. How are you going to prove that your guy's Jose Parra is the same Jose Parra in the LA Times article?" That was a good question. In California, the name Parra is nearly as common as Williams or Smith. There's got to be hundreds of Jose Parras. That was a variable I hadn't taken into consideration, Chris told me. And there was a good chance the government would take the same position. You had the articles. Yeah, but prosecutors are very good at twisting facts. We needed something concrete, something definitive. Following the release of the articles, Chris completed the habeas petition and Juan filed it with the court. In his motion, Juan claimed that his due process rights had been violated because he had been sentenced on the basis of false or inaccurate information. He also claimed that the government had engaged in prejudicial misconduct that had undermined the integrity of his sentencing. Specifically, Juan claimed the prosecutor had made false statements which had worked to Juan's detriment. He also claimed the government had improperly withheld exculpatory information. Days after the filing, Judge Baer ordered Juan to show cause as to why the motion shouldn't be dismissed as untimely. In response, Chris filed declarations from Juan and his former defense counsel, David Arredondo, in support of Juan's timeliness arguments. As they waited for the court's decision, the issue of connecting Juan's Parra to the deceased Parra weighed on Chris's mind. "We needed someone that could make that connection," says Chris. "Someone beyond reproach. That's when I came up with the idea of contacting the homicide detectives. According to the newspapers, they didn't seem to have any leads, so if Juan offered to give them some background information regarding Parra's drug activity, they'd definitely come out to see him." Chris had been through a homicide investigation, and he was familiar with the basic procedures involved. I knew the first thing the detective would do was establish whether Juan knew the deceased, using a photo lineup. Once Juan picked out the correct Parra, we'd be able to subpoena the detective to prove that Juan's Parra and the deceased were one and the same. "And Juan was okay with this?" I asked. "Not really," snickers Chris. Initially, Juan was concerned that he could get in more trouble for the additional drug activity he would have to discuss. But once I explained that wasn't possible, he was all for it. On July 17, 2013, Chris wrote a letter to the Homicide Bureau of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. "I kept telling Juan, once we mail this, they're definitely coming. So if you had anything to do with this guy getting killed, this is the wrong route to go." But he said, "Mail it." So I mailed it. Detective Brian Sonemacher was waiting in the conference room when Juan was led in by SIS Officer Messias. It was around 8:30 a.m., September 12, 2013. The officer sat in a plastic chair off to the side of the rectangular table in the center of the room. Juan took the chair opposite Sonemacher. All Juan had been instructed to do was provide the detective with some background information regarding his drug activity with Parra. Initially, things went as planned. Sonemacher's irritation that Juan didn't have anything concrete on the murder was obvious, but he'd asked Juan to identify Jose Parra's photo, just as Chris had predicted, which proved that Juan clearly knew the Jose Parra being discussed in the newspaper articles. The detective even acknowledged that the authorities were aware that Parra had been a big-time drug trafficker in L.A. That was the entire purpose of the meeting. After that, however, the interview went off script. "Something's not right here," griped the homicide detective. "I think you're lying. I think you know who's responsible for Parra's murder." "How would I know?" replied Juan. He hadn't seen Parra in nearly a decade. "I don't know anything." "Bullshit," grunted Sonemacher. He glanced around in frustration and added, "Why do you think he was killed?" That's when Juan's ego got the better of him. Despite being specifically instructed not to mention his theory Parra was a confidential informant, Juan blurted out, "Come on, you know why." "No, I don't know why." You tell me. Other than Parra's wife overhearing the discussion over the cartel's money, there is very little likelihood the detective had any solid leads. Come on, you know he was a snitch, snapped Juan. He added, a CI, and made air quotes with his index and middle finger. You know. Sonamaker went cadaver stiff. All movements stopped and the room went morgue quiet. It was clear the detective had no leads that indicated Parra was an informant, for one very specific reason. Parra wasn't an informant. What are you talking about? At this point, Juan lost his cool and shrieked, Don't bullshit me! You know what I'm talking about! He was making cases all over the place for you guys. Baltimore, Chicago, New York, L.A. Juan jabbed his finger toward the photograph of Parra and spat. He's the reason I'm in prison. He cost me and my friends millions. He got us all busted. Juan began ranting about how the U.S. attorney had given his lawyer some paperwork indicating Parra was a CI. Read my paperwork, Juan kept saying. Read my motion, it's all in there. Sonamaker reared back and said, It sounds like you and your friends had something to do with the murder. No, stammered Juan. Lots of people wanted him killed, lots of people. But it came out weak and ripe with insincerity. He knew he'd said too much. He shut down and went silent. Juan tracked Chris down at his housing unit and regurgitated the catastrophic blunder he'd made during the interview. Chris could feel the color drain from his face when Juan admitted to telling the detective that Parra was the reason he was in prison and that he'd cost Juan and his friends millions. Oh my God, gasped Chris. I told you not to mention your theory that Parra was a CI. You just gave them evidence of motive, evidence of intent. Chris told Juan that the detective's next move would be to call his prosecutor and confirm Parra wasn't a confidential informant in his case. Then he's going to have the BOP pull all of your phone calls. But he was a CI. You're the only one who thinks that! You and that crackpot lawyer! Juan's only saving grace, Chris told him, was that he didn't have anything to do with the murder. Once he figures out Parra's not a CI, he's going to put it together with the fact that you erroneously believe he was, thus making you the only one with a motive. From that point on, Chris began referring to Juan as goofball to himself and to his fellow inmate/legal assistant and typist, Scott Robinson. Chris worked as the lieutenant's orderly, cleaning up and emptying the trash in the administration's offices. As a result, he knew most of the prison staff, so Chris made it a point to bump into SIS Officer Messias later that day. He casually asked how Juan's interview had gone. Not good, replied Messias. Your little friend lost his composure. He gave Chris a sideways glance and almost whispered, You sure this guy didn't have anything to do with that murder? Says he didn't. Well, he sure looked guilty. A week after that conversation, Officer Messias confided in Chris that Detective Sonamaker requested the BOP pull all of Juan's recorded calls. Messias volunteered that if the detective asked, he was going to have no choice but to mention Chris was doing Juan's legal work. Chris told Messias that he had no problem talking with the detectives. On October 22, 2013, Juan received the government's response to his habeas action. Chris read it the following day, and it was devastating. The government had not only disclosed the wiretap transcripts to Juan's attorney, they had also provided Juan a copy via the warden at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, and they had multiple exhibits to substantiate their claims. As Chris read, he could feel anger welling up inside. Juan's claim alleged that the government engaged in prejudicial misconduct that undermined his sentencing. However, the wiretap evidence supporting his claims had been provided to both Juan and his defense attorney. Because Juan hadn't raised the claim at sentencing or on appeal, he was now procedurally defaulted, i.e., unable to present the issue to the court. And because they had had this evidence in their possession all along, Juan's claims were also time-barred. Did you have the wiretap transcripts? Asked Chris. He showed Juan the exhibit of the letter to the warden. They sent them to you at MCC prior to sentencing. Juan shook his head emphatically while mumbling, No, I never saw him. Then he stopped and said, Oh, yeah, they sent me something, but I never looked at it. Why not? My attorney told me he had everything handled. Juan's entire argument was based on the government improperly withholding evidence that they clearly had turned over, and making false statements during his sentencing that Juan's attorney could have disputed at the time. That's it, you're time barred. It doesn't matter whether you looked at it or not, you could have. You're dead in the water, said Chris, shaking his head in disgust at the colossal mess Juan had created. And that's the least of your problems. What do you mean? Exhibit A to the government's response was a 6-page report documenting Juan's cooperative efforts with the DEA following his arrest. The report summarized the post-arrest statement Juan had provided, admitting his involvement in the conspiracy and implicating his co-conspirators, Cuco, Moreno, Salinas, and Parra, among others. Chris couldn't help but simmer at the hypocrisy. Juan, the stand-up guy, had actually made monitored calls for the DEA to Cuco in an attempt to get him and Parra busted. He'd been strutting around for the last decade calling Parra a snitch and a CI when he'd actually cooperated. In addition to Juan implicating himself and everyone else, thereby undermining his defense, the government had also indicated that Parra wasn't an informant, once and for all, proving that Juan was the only one with a motive to murder Parra. "You're this close," growled Chris, holding up his hand with his index and thumb half an inch apart, "to getting charged with Parra's murder." "I can't be charged," snarled Juan defiantly. "I'm in prison. I have an alibi." "Don't you understand? It's a conspiracy charge. You don't have to be the shooter to be charged for conspiracy. I'm here for a murder I didn't personally commit. They'll put it on you," yelled Chris. "They'll hit you with conspiracy." In most cases, the government tries to prove that the accused had a motive to commit the crime, but you've already admitted to having a motive. The next morning, around 11:30 a.m., Chris noticed Juan standing in the chow line. His eyes were bloodshot. His hair was a mess. They took a walk around the compound, and Juan confessed he hadn't slept at all the previous night. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you were saying yesterday," said Juan. "I know you're going to be upset, but just listen. I don't want to get charged with Parra's murder." He indicated he hadn't been straight up with Chris about the murder. "I know why he was killed, and who had it done." "Fuck!" hissed Chris. He could feel a ball of anxiety forming in the pit of his stomach. "What did you do?" Not long after Juan's sentencing, he'd started broadcasting his belief that Parra was a DEA informant, but no one in the Federation's leadership believed him. Parra had been too crucial of a part of the organization. Then, in 2008, there was a series of drug busts by the DEA. In Chicago, Cuco's brother-in-law was caught with over 300 kilos of cocaine. There was over 500 kilos intercepted by the DEA in Ontario, California, where G maintained his stash house. And additional loads were seized in LA, resulting in over a ton of Sinaloa Cartel cocaine being seized. Product that G's man in Los Angeles, Parra, would have been responsible for. Suddenly, it seemed possible that Parra might have been compromised. In 2009, Ricardo Barajas got word to Juan requesting he send him any documentation regarding Parra acting as an informant. Juan immediately fired off a letter summarizing attorney Arredondo's statements about Parra being a confidential informant, along with his court transcripts and the DEA report stating Jose LNU CI. Juan had the materials delivered to Barajas in Guadalajara. For Barajas and Cuco, that document, along with their attorney's statements, solidified Parra's guilt. The information Juan supplied sparked a contentious meeting between G and Parra, who operated within Mayo's faction of the Sinaloa Federation, on one side, and Barajas and Cuco, who operated under Nacho's faction. After presenting the proof of Parra's cooperation to G, according to Juan, Cuco and Barajas demanded that G make them whole and return the $3.5 million that Cuco and Juan had reimbursed him for years earlier. "And I want my ranch back," said Cuco. He then pointed to Parra and spat. "And that motherfucker dead." "That's not going to happen," replied G. "He's not responsible for the losses." G drew a line in the sand, refusing to accept that Parra was an informant, and the meeting ended in an impasse. That would have been the end of it. However, the following year, in July 2010, Nacho Coronel was killed in a shootout with the Mexican military. The following day, his brother was murdered. The Coronel clan blamed Chapo for orchestrating the assassinations. Nacho's nephews, one of whom is Ricardo Barajas, immediately broke away from the Federation and formed an organization calling itself Nueva Generación, or New Generation. The New Generation organization then formed an alliance with the Milenio organization, headed by Nemesio Osquera Cervantes, or El Mencho. Together, the two organizations became known as the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. In the spring of 2011, the New Generation Cartel declared war on all other Mexican cartels and immediately unleashed their military wing, known as the Matazetas. One of its cells was headed by Cuco Bernales. Later that summer, under Mencho's leadership, the New Generation achieved international notoriety when 35 dead bodies of rival cartel members were dumped in a wealthy suburb of Veracruz. According to Juan, that was the work of Cuco's group. By that autumn, the New Generation had achieved its goal and seized control of the state of Jalisco, including its capital, the megacity of Guadalajara. The New Generation had expanded its operation network from coast to coast in a matter of months. The New Generation then formed an uneasy alliance with the vestiges of the Sinaloa Cartel. The agreement allowed for each organization to traffic product through the other's territory, in addition to the use of the New Generation's maritime ports and Sinaloa's drug smuggling routes. Cuco inherited control of the plaza in Guadalajara when his faction of the Matazetas prevailed in the power structure for control of the city. Once he'd asserted his control over the territory, one of Barajas's and Cuco's first orders of business was to have Parra killed. On December 12, 2011, Parra and his family were ambushed at their home in Arcadia. He was executed as his wife and children stood in the adjacent room. He went to his death denying responsibility. Cuco had him killed in retaliation for cooperating with the DEA and losing the money, said Juan, and getting me busted. Are you out of your fucking mind? Chris exploded. Why'd we file the motion if you knew your people were good for this murder? Juan insisted he'd only learned about the murder after the fact. However, he was concerned because he'd been the driving force behind labeling Parra an informant. Are you crazy? Cuco killed Parra. He's crazy. He killed Chico, one of his distributors. However, the authorities have never recovered Chico's body. Juan confessed that Cuco was good for at least 3 additional murders in Chicago, 1 in Arizona, and hundreds in Mexico. But I didn't kill anybody. You sent the report to a homicidal maniac responsible for hundreds of murders, growled Chris. Then you lied to a homicide detective about the murder, who at that very moment was possibly listening to Juan's calls. This is a fucking disaster, Chris snapped at Juan and stomped off. Once inside his housing unit, he immediately wrote a memo to himself documenting the time and date. Juan had caused an innocent man to be killed, and there was the very real possibility that the homicide detectives would put it together. At a minimum, Juan had obstructed the homicide investigation. Chris's fear was that he'd eventually be interviewed, and during that interview, he would be placed in a position where he would either have to lie or implicate Juan, and he had no intention of lying. On the evening of October 27, 2013, Chris met with Juan to discuss how they could undermine the government's claim that Juan had been the leader of the cartel's distribution in L.A. Were there any additional cases or seizures after you were arrested? Asked Chris. Something we can point at to show that you were just a cog in Parra's much larger conspiracy, that the cartel's distribution network continued without you. Sure, replied Juan. There was a case in Detroit involving Johan, Moreno's brother-in-law, and Carlos Medina. It was a big case, a few 100-kilo conspiracy. He told Chris that there were additional cases. I'll get them for you. The next morning, Juan handed Chris a note identifying multiple cases that he had identified, showing the distribution continued without him. I remember a couple, he said. Juan pointed to the Cicero entry on the handwritten note and explained, This one's Cuco's compadre. He was charged in Chicago on a 500-kilo conspiracy. Jose supplied all that product. Juan then pointed to the 2008 Joliet entry. "This one's Cuco's brother-in-law. He got busted with 385 keys. I know Jose set this one up too, bro. That's over $6 million on this one bust alone. That's the one that caused Ricky Barajas and Cuco to come around to my way of thinking about Parra. That's when they started believing me." Earlier that year, I'd won my appeal, Chris tells me. He was waiting to be brought back to court to have what he believed would be a considerable amount of time cut from his sentence. And the homicide detectives, at that very moment, were making arrangements to interview him regarding Juan's case. I was in exactly the position I'd been trying to avoid. "Why?" I ask. "Other than a motive, which in and of itself doesn't mean Juan did anything, homicide didn't have anything." "You don't understand. Parra was killed in the furtherance of the drug conspiracy that Juan was in prison for," Chris explains. "The Supreme Court has held that a person can be held criminally liable for the actions of a co-conspirator if those actions were reasonably foreseeable. Even assuming Juan's statements about a lack of foreknowledge were true, he could still have been charged because he should have known that his actions would result in his associates killing Parra. He should have realized how Cuco would react. Plus, there was another issue. Juan talked on the phone all the time." Depending on the institution, inmates are limited to 300 minutes a month of phone time. However, wealthy inmates often buy poorer inmates' time by using their PIN numbers to access their accounts. Juan confided he was very worried about the detectives listening to his calls, because after Parra had been killed, he was speaking with a friend from Guadalajara who let him know Parra had been taken care of. "Do you know when that call was made?" "Yeah, I can identify the specific phone call," says Chris. Even worse, when he told Juan about the murder, Juan didn't say, "Why'd you do that?" or even act shocked. Instead, he said something along the line of, "Good, fuck him." Essentially, Juan made an expression of approval. He was really worried about that call. Chris was cleaning Lompoc lieutenant's office on November 14, 2013, when Officer Messias mentioned that the homicide detectives were asking questions about Juan. Messias wasn't sure it was going to be possible to keep Chris's name out of the investigation. "You're doing all this guy's legal work," said the officer. "They're going to want to talk to you." Chris shrugged it off, telling him, "I've got attorneys. If they want to talk to me, they can call them." Hours later, however, when Chris mentioned the conversation to Juan, it sent him into a panic. He was certain that he'd be indicted. That's when he asked Chris, "What would you do?" Chris told Juan that when he was first arrested, both the FBI and DEA had asked him for his assistance. Unfortunately, he was young and arrogant. He made the fatal decision not to cooperate. His co-conspirators, however, had no such loyalty, and, subsequently, he became the focus of the investigation. Ultimately, this led to Chris being charged with conspiracy to murder an FBI informant. "It was the biggest mistake of my life," he admitted. "You have a chance to get out in front of this thing. You get a lawyer to contact the homicide detectives, and you come clean with them." By cooperating in the murder investigation, Juan not only had a chance to avoid being charged as a conspirator or for having obstructed the investigation, he would likely have received a sentence reduction for cooperating. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but—" "No," he interrupted. "I'm not going to do that." Juan didn't want to put his family at risk, he explained. He also planned to get back into trafficking drugs upon his release. "I'm going to need these guys." "Are you out of your fucking mind? You're 9 in on a 25-year sentence. These guys aren't going to be around when you get out," Chris shot back. "With the exception of Mayo and Chapo, the shelf life of a narco is a few years tops. How much longer do you expect these guys to be alive? To be able to avoid arrest?" He explained that the moment these guys were arrested, they would cooperate. "That's not going to happen," scoffed Juan. "They're in Mexico." "That doesn't mean anything." Over the last decade, numerous drug kingpins have been apprehended in Mexico, nearly all of whom had been extradited to the United States and immediately began cooperating with federal law enforcement. The U.S. isn't Mexico. They're all looking at life sentences. Their only option is to give up murders on American soil. Over the next 2 weeks, the conversation dragged on. Chris tried to convince Juan to cooperate. "It's the smart move," he told him over and over. It finally came to a head on December 1st when Chris said, You can't come to prison and keep making the same mistakes that got you here. That's what you're doing. Look, I can't, okay? Why? Because, blurted out Juan. I told them to kill him. I knew it was going to happen. After the formation of the New Generation Cartel, Juan's partners agreed to kill Parra for Juan. I'm the one that sent word to Ricky and he told Cuco to kill him. Juan had been so convincing in his denial of having any prior knowledge of the murder that Chris was stunned by the admission. Once he regained his bearings, he told Juan that was all the more reason to cooperate. At a minimum, Ricky and Cuco know that you ordered the hit. Both of them have right-hand men. Not counting the shooter, that's at least 4 men who could implicate you in this murder. It was also inconceivable that they'd have killed someone as crucial as Parra without clearing it through Mencho and Mayo first. That's at least 8 guys that know you're responsible. And G, admitted Juan. G was the only one who knew where Parra lived. The implication that the upper echelon of the 2 major cartels in Mexico knew Juan was responsible for Parra's murder was sobering. It was only a matter of time before they were arrested and extradited. The minute any one of them touches American soil, said Chris, they're going to turn on you. No, that's not possible, mumbled Juan in a daze. They're too high up. They're all protected. Days after that exchange, Chris learned that the government had requested to have his resentencing delayed. His concern was that the government had learned through SIS or the homicide detectives of Juan's potential involvement with the Parra murder, and they intended to use that information to undermine the extent of Chris's sentence reduction by telling the court that he was once again embroiled in yet another homicide investigation. He spoke with a close friend, Scott Robinson, concerning Juan and the situation surrounding the murder. I don't know what to do, Chris told Scotty. I don't want to get this guy jammed up, but I'm in a fucked up position here. You gotta do whatever's gonna protect you, he said. Look, this guy's an idiot. He's going to get me caught up in his bullshit unless I start looking out for myself. Fuck, he had an innocent man killed. In order to protect himself, Chris fired off an email to his attorney to apprise him of the situation regarding the Parra murder investigation. From that moment forward, he began documenting every noteworthy event through time-date stamped memos, as well as copying all relevant paperwork. Although the Parra murder never came up at Chris's sentencing, while he was in transit, Chapo Guzman was arrested. The most powerful drug lord in Mexico was taken into custody on February 22, 2014, in the city of Mazatlan, Sinaloa. The U.S. government immediately moved for Chapo's extradition. Juan was sick over it. Sometime in April 2014, Chris came across a Time magazine article titled Top Member of Mexican Drug Cartel Aiding U.S. Authorities. The story revealed that Mayo Zambada's son, Vicente Zambada, had been cooperating with the FBI and the DEA following his extradition. Zambada had been responsible for overseeing the importation of tons of cocaine on behalf of his father and Chapo, cocaine that G, in turn, shipped to Jose Parra in Los Angeles. I showed it to Juan, says Chris. We're sitting at a large rectangular table in Coleman's library, and Chris has brought his documentation book with him. It's an inch thick, wrapped in a glossy black jacket cover, and bound with plastic anchors. Inside its covers are all of the pertinent documents needed to tie Juan to Parra's murder. Right, I reply, as he flips through the book to a copy of the Time article. Chris tells me he pointed out to Juan that Zambada was clearly in a position to identify G and may very well have known of Parra, who was a key member of Mayo Zambada's American-based distribution network. I told Juan, Zambada's been cooperating for over a year. We knew he was cooperating against Chapo and Mayo, which meant he was probably cooperating against G. During Memorial Day weekend, Chris, Juan, and Juan's buddy, George Medina, were sitting outside the unit when the conversation turned to Juan's case. They began exploring different options, which led to a discussion surrounding the events that culminated in Juan's arrest. During the course of the conversation, Juan mentioned Parra had been working with the DEA to Medina and said, "That's why I had that motherfucker killed." "What?" replied Medina. "You did that?" Of course, said Juan. Parra was the source. But I thought the government said he wasn't the snitch, that it was the wiretaps that got you busted. They're lying, snapped Juan. Over a month later, Chris, Juan, and Medina were once again discussing Juan's case when Juan, once again, openly stated he'd ordered Parra's murder. On November 24, 2014, the court denied Juan's habeas action. Chris felt like it was over. The homicide detectives hadn't come to interview him, and it didn't seem like they were going to. However, lying in his bunk at night, Chris couldn't stop thinking about Parra's wife and kids. Granted, he'd chosen the wrong line of work. As a narco-trafficker, you know the risks. One miscalculation could end in prison or death. Regardless, as far as Chris could tell, from a trafficker's perspective, Parra had made all the right moves. Through intelligence, cunning, balls, and a good deal of luck, Parra had climbed the ranks to the very top. Despite all that, he'd ended up with 4 slugs in his head. Not because he'd screwed up, but because of Juan's ego. Because of a self-absorbed, narcissistic wannabe narco's arrogance, Parra died. By the spring of 2015, the Jalisco New Generation had emerged as the most dangerous cartel in Mexico. In retaliation for the arrest of over a dozen of Mencho's people, on April 7th, they ambushed a convoy of elite Mexican military officers, killing 15 and seriously wounding 5. Weeks later, during Operation Jalisco, 5,000 soldiers converged on the state of Jalisco to capture Mencho, resulting in the Matazetas, who had been trained by former Israeli commandos, wreaking havoc. They overturned buses and cars to create blockades, blew military helicopters out of the sky with surface-to-air rockets, and firebombed banks and gas stations in order to create the chaos necessary for the cartel's leaders to escape. In April 2015, the U.S. government designated the New Generation Cartel as the most powerful cartel in Mexico. There was an announcement over the PA system ordering Chris to the lieutenant's office. It wasn't a big deal. He was the lieutenant's orderly, and they called him over the PA a half dozen times a day. This time, however, when Chris got to the office, an officer told him, "Go to R&D. Messias is waiting for you." There, Officer Messias gave Chris a concerned look and said, "There's a couple people here to see you." Inside the conference room were 2 law enforcement types, a female FBI agent and some other agent in a suit, sitting at a small circular table. Chris was caught completely by surprise. His attorney hadn't spoken with the FBI regarding the homicide. Due to the new generation's propensity for violence, he was unwilling to represent Chris in connection with the Parra murder investigation. Instead, the agents took it upon themselves to show up at the prison unannounced. "We understand you may have information concerning the Parra murder investigation," said Agent Medrano. "Yeah," he replied, now keenly aware that he'd been seen going into R&D by over 50 inmates on the compound, many of whom were cartel members, and several of the R&D orderlies. The longer he stayed in the office, the more questions he'd be required to answer by the other inmates. Inmates get stabbed, even murdered, in prison for cooperating with law enforcement. Juan had a suspected informant murdered in the safety of his own home. He could easily have someone killed in Lompoc. "I'm in a position to help you, but I'm going to need something in writing. All we're here to do is determine what you can provide us. What are you doing?" There were hundreds of cartel members at Lompoc Federal Correctional Institution, and the longer Chris stayed in that room, the worse things looked for him. "I can't talk here." "Can you identify the shooter?" asked Medrano, completely unconcerned with the danger she was placing Chris in. "No, the shooter's irrelevant, but I can identify the conspirators, why he was murdered, and who ordered him killed." Chris was in the process of getting himself transferred to a prison in Florida, and he expected to be moved any day. "I'll talk to you when I get to Florida," he said, and quickly exited the conference room, then bolted out of R&D. A few weeks later, on July 11, 2015, Chapo escaped from a maximum security prison through a mile-long tunnel. That night, various factions of inmate cartel members threw a large celebratory party. While Chris was sipping on a diet soda and watching the inmates joking and laughing, Juan came up from behind Chris, stopping beside him. "See, Chris, I told you there was nothing to worry about," he said. "They're protected. We can do anything." A week or so later, Chris was transferred to the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex in Florida, as far away from Juan as he could get. However, Juan continued to stay in touch with Chris through emails. On December 3rd, Chris was called into his counselor's office. Counselor Clausen told him she'd received several messages from an LA homicide detective named Tim Holguin. "I'll need you to talk to this guy, or," she shrugged, "tell him you don't want to talk to him, so he'll stop calling me." "Fuck," hissed Chris. "I'll talk to him." Roughly a week later, Clausen got Chris on the phone with the detective. He immediately began asking Chris details about Parra. "Look," interrupted Chris, "I have information pertinent to your investigation, but I want an agreement in writing and an attorney to represent me," and he ended the call. On January 8, 2016, Chapo was rearrested in Las Mochis, Sinaloa. A month later, Chris was notified that the Federal Defender's Office had asked the court to appoint an attorney to represent him in connection with the Parra investigation. That spring, the court appointed Alan Dressler. Chris and Dressler met in the attorney-client conference room in the prison's visitation area in May 2016. Dressler had flown to Florida from California for the meeting. "This is unusual," the lawyer told Chris, seated opposite him underneath the harsh fluorescent lights with Chris's black book resting on the table. "The court seldom appoints counsel simply to explore the possibility of cooperation." "There's a good reason for it," replied Chris. "This is a cartel-related revenge killing of a suspected federal informant." He laid out the entire story for the lawyer, along with the players, Juan Garcia, Ricardo Barajas, Cuco Bernales, and German Olivares, along with Mayo Zambada, Chapo Guzman, and Mencho. He presented him with all of the facts and the documentation to support his claims. Chris identified the federal prosecution in New York that the Parra murder had been committed in the furtherance of, as well as the prosecutions in Chicago and Brooklyn that the murder was related to. After Chris had armed Dressler with an overview of the case, the attorney said, "The FBI and the homicide detectives are definitely going to want to talk to you about this." "Look, I want to do the right thing," said Chris, "but I can't cooperate with the government and serve out the remainder of my sentence in prison." Juan and his people had already proven that they had no problem having someone murdered in the safety of his own home for potentially being a CI. There was no doubt that they could have him murdered in prison, where it would be even easier to have him killed for actually cooperating. "I need to have the remainder of my sentence reduced," he had 7 years remaining, "and witness protection." By midsummer, Dressler had begun discussing the matter with the U.S. Attorney's Office. However, they continued to pass the buck from one supervisor to another with virtually no movement. Then, on January 19, 2017, Chapo was extradited to the United States to face charges in Brooklyn related to the Sinaloa Cartel. A few weeks later, the U.S. Justice Department requested that the prison send them a copy of Chris's central file. During a phone call on March 10th, Dressler told Chris the government wanted his assistance in connection with the Parra murder. "I'm getting calls from the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office," said the lawyer. In his opinion, the renewed interest was related to Chapo's extradition. "Everybody's on this now." Dressler spent the next week nailing down the specifics of Chris's agreement with an assistant U.S. attorney named Stephen Meyer. In a phone call on March 17th, Dressler informed Chris, "We have a deal." The U.S. Attorney's Office had accepted Chris's terms, and they were moving forward. Meyer told Dressler that the detectives had received approval to travel to Florida to interview Chris. The only holdup at this point was scheduling everyone to be there: Dressler, the FBI, and the homicide detectives. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. Then, on April 17th, Chris called Dressler for an update, and the attorney said, "It's dead." "Dead?" replied Chris. "They said we had an agreement. What happened?" "Everything was going fine," admitted Dressler. After AUSA Meyer had agreed, he then asked Dressler to make a factual proffer, detailing the nature and extent of Chris's assistance, including the extent of all of the parties involved. He just changed his mind. Chris asked the attorney to try and find out what the issue was. On May 3rd, Dressler told Chris that he had been deceived by AUSA Meyer into making a factual proffer under the belief they had an agreement. However, he was unable to determine why the government had suddenly switched gears and reversed itself. When Dressler contacted the homicide detectives in Los Angeles, Detective Lohman told him that Meyer hadn't contacted them. "Meyer lied to me," Dressler told Chris. There was no approval to interview Chris regarding the Parra investigation. In fact, Detective Lohman was completely unaware that Meyer was working to schedule an interview. He didn't know any of this was even happening. "What do you think happened?" I asked Chris as we walk around the compound. It's October 9th, 2017, and there has been no movement since the May 3rd, 2017 call with Chris's attorney. "I think it's very possible that the government wanted my information, but they never intended to give me anything. At this very moment, the FBI may be using that information to investigate Juan, Barajas, G, and Cuco for Parra's murder. Juan could further connect Chapo and Mayo to the conspiracy. They had no intention of reducing my sentence for the information. That's why they had to trick my attorney into divulging privileged information." The problem for Chris at this point is his name. His real name is now associated with reports concerning the Parra murder. Even redacting his name won't stop the conspirators from discovering his assistance in connection with the matter. As a result, he is potentially in danger. "So," I ask, "Juan got an innocent man killed?" Chris nods his reply. In fact, Parra wasn't responsible for any of the losses or for Juan getting indicted. The 2008 seizures were a result of the Flores brothers in Chicago tipping off the DEA regarding G's shipments. "Still," continues Chris, "Parra had to pay the Jalisco price." "I don't like to speculate," I tell him, "but it's possible that the government simply doesn't care about Parra. To them, he's just some dead Mexican drug dealer." "Yeah, I thought about that," replies Chris. "I can see that, but you know who does care? The homicide detectives. The government's gone out of their way to thwart their investigation. I know the detectives want to solve this murder. Do you know who else cares? Parra's American wife and kids, who had to listen as their husband and father took 4 bullets to the head for something he didn't do. I'm sure his wife and children care."